I want to talk with you today about the city as service, the idea that we are moving into a new relationship with our cities. And I believe that that relationship is difficult to map to from where we are today, that we are in the process of discontinuous change, right? That we're in the process of moving into a future for which the past is a bad roadmap. And I'm going to share with you 4 forces that I think are really shaping that future. There's obviously a lot of ground to cover here, and I know that many of you are experts, and so there's whole bits of stuff that I've left out, including things like green building, green infrastructure, and so on, because I know that there is more knowledge in this room than I have by far. So just to get going, I wanted to start at the very highest level, because that's what I do for a living. I talk with folks about the biggest picture and how that picture is changing and what that means to their lives. So we're going to start with the force of planetary limits. It is no secret, I hope, that we live on a single planet, that we are utterly reliant on the biosphere of that planet for everything in our lives, for our entire civilization. That we are part of that planet for as long as we can anticipate. There is no planet B, right? Even the Earth-like planets that we're finding out there are, like 100,000 years of travel away, right? So there's no, easy vacation home in a universal sense. And we also, of course, are inhabiting that planet in a new way. Human population is on its way to being 10 billion, 9 billion if we really get some things right. We've already, though, reached peak baby, a fact you may not know. There are no longer more babies being born every year, where we've kind of leveled off. And now, basically, our population growth is due to longevity. It's due to people not dying, which is a hard thing to argue with. However, that does mean that we will soon be in the position of having the most humans who've ever been alive, and possibly the most humans who ever will be alive at one time. And those humans will be living in cities, right? We are already an urban species. Cities are adding 200 to 250,000 urban dwellers every day. That's a city the size of San Francisco every 3 to 4 days. And within the next 40 years, that means that we're going to see the largest building boom in human history, and probably the largest that will ever occur. Making cities is now the major thing humans do. And those cities are growing precisely because they offer people an opportunity at a better life, right? Cities are the best mechanism we have for raising people out of poverty. And we've seen the global middle class, those people who are no longer living only from necessity, but are able to actually save money, invest, buy things, growing rapidly. We'll have 3 billion people in the global middle class by 2030. We'll have 5 billion by 2050. And that means billions, of course, billions and billions of phones, electrical service, refrigerators, washing machines. If you don't think a washing machine is important, I encourage you to watch Hans Rosling's talk about washing machines and his family in Sweden. It also means a lot of competition for resources, a lot more pressure on the supplies we have of things. And since we are utterly dependent on the planet around us, and we have very limited supplies of resources available to us, it means we're pushing past, of course, what we can actually sustainably use. And the results are everywhere all around us. The most blatant and obvious result is climate change, which is now here and upon us. We're all connected to the same set of climate systems, and so far that's not going very well. As you may have noticed, this is, for example, a river of melting ice water. And we're more and more beginning to understand the precise nature of that problem. How many people here read much of the IPCC's latest report? Wow, you're like a dream audience. Okay, so then you guys know that we have moved from a general discussion of rates, we need to emit something less at this rate, to a precise budget, right? A consensus budget. We now know that there's only so much CO2 that we can put into the atmosphere without running off the rails. That budget is 800 gigatons of carbon dioxide, and that gives us a 2/3 chance of staying under 2 degrees. 2 degrees is already pretty hairy, as we'll see in a minute. But going past 2 degrees is catastrophic. Reaching that budget is not going to be easy, right? So this is, up till now, this is actually slightly out of date. We're I think, at about almost 540 gigatons of CO2, 550, something like that. But if you look at 2% each year, which has been sort of the growth rate we've been on, we have until 2032 of our current emissions, and then we have to just stop emitting altogether in order to stay under that bar. And even taking on more and more risk, having a 1 in 2 chance only gets us to 2035, having a 1 in 3 chance only to 2037. And of course, at that point, we are still emitting more and more, and we're riding off into the danger zone. And we're starting to head up to 4 degrees, 5 degrees. You know, at 5 degrees, the last time the world was 5 degrees hotter, there were alligators in the Arctic. So these are serious challenges here. And we don't want to do that. But what it means is that we have to start to think about how much time we have left to stay within that budget. As I said before, growing 2% a year, we're there very quickly. Even if we leveled off and grew no more, but just kept emissions flat, we're going to run out of budget in the late 2030s. Declining 2% a year, we buy ourselves some time, right? But we're still running off the rails mid-century. If we decline 3.5% a year, we may well stay under the line, right? 3.5% a year is a lot. It's a lot of emissions reductions. And really, the kicker is the longer we wait, the steeper that curve gets, right? Every year we wait means we have to reduce at a faster rate in order to not run off the rails. And on top of this, the more we heat the Earth, the more danger there is. I don't know if many of you saw the climate departure study that came out recently. Climate departure is the year in which the mean temperature in a place rises above the previous highs, right? So basically you're in a whole new climate. There was a meta-study done, and it recently showed the year at which various cities will reach climate departure, at which they'll live in completely new cities. For some places in Indonesia, it's as soon as 2020. Here, it's probably something like 2047, 2050. And that's wild, right? That's living in a new time and place. It's living on a new planet, fundamentally. And we know that when you add that much heat energy to a system, weird things start to happen. People described Sandy as a black swan. Sandy wasn't a black swan. Sandy was a black elephant, right? Black elephants are the things that are sitting right in the middle of the room that everybody knows about and nobody refuses to acknowledge, right? They're things that surprise us but don't, right? Climate disasters are black elephants. We know that they're going to become more regular, more severe. We know that, in fact, large parts of the world are becoming uninsurable, right? That reinsurance agencies will not back up insurance there. We know that there's residual damage occurring. Residual damage is the most bloodless term for a very horrific thing, which is places where the cost of adaptation simply is not worth saving the place, right? So a place which doesn't have enough inherent value to be saved is termed residual damage. And residual damage is going to be like a guiding principle of the next 20 years. We know that in order to avoid this getting much worse, we're going to have to cut emissions a lot. And we know that the countries that are emitting the most are going to have to go first, right? It's just the way that the world works. And we know that the emissions are pretty steep, that we're going to have to come down to the globally equitable, sort of sustainable level is about 1 ton of CO2 per capita. You know, right now, Americans are in the 18 tons per capita range, right? That's a huge, huge shift. And it means that some fundamental things in our cities are going to be changing rapidly. Energy use in the US is largely related. The largest part of it is related to transportation. We see that system as immovable. We see the cars that we drive as an essential part of life. Our commitment to the automobile seems irreversible. We see the infrastructure that we've built for that system to be just the way things are, and we're still building more of it. We see the places that we've built that are utterly car dependent as the way that, that places come now. But that which can't go on doesn't. And we have put ourselves in a situation where huge portions of our cities are vulnerable, right? So this is a map of the shortest way to get from point A to point B in a Florida suburb, right? This is a structurally brittle place. Not that many roads, in fact, probably only one, needs to go out before point A and point B are no longer connected, right? But we have not only structurally brittle places, we have operationally brittle places, right? We have more and more places where cost of energy, for example, can make a place collapse. We're seeing the demographic inversion of the poor being forced out into suburbs as cities become wealthier. We're seeing the collapse of large lot single-family home prices in large parts of the country, and we're seeing the emergence of a spatial underclass, right, of people who are driven to places that don't work anymore because that's what's cheap. I was once given a tour of an exurb that wasn't doing well, and I noticed there were a lot of shopping carts around. I asked the guy who was giving me the tour, what's up with that? And he said, oh, well, there isn't very good transit service out here, so if you are a relatively poor person who can no longer afford a car, the only way you have to get your stuff to the transit station is to push it in a shopping cart. So I encourage you the next time you're in a struggling exurb to look for the shopping carts. This is the world that we have already set in motion. And it's about to hit climate reality with brutal force, which might lead us to ask, what next, right? If that were the end of the story, we could all just kind of go to the bar now, right? We have this horrific gap between what we must do and what we think we can. But remember, there are three more forces left. The first is that cities themselves are an answer to this problem. The continuation of the unsustainable is not our only option. Many of you are probably familiar with passive house design, right? Or at least the principles behind it, right? That it is possible to build a home which is sufficiently insulated, well-sited, properly ventilated with a heat exchanger fan and so forth, that heating and energy costs drop dramatically. In the right climate, you can even do away with heating and air conditioning. This is essentially a demand reduction strategy, right? And demand reduction, as you probably all know, is critical because energy efficiency maintains, if you have an air conditioner and you make it more efficient, first of all, there are limits to how efficient you can make it. But by making that by still using that air conditioner, we of course are still linked into an entire system of choices that bring that air conditioner to us. It's by eliminating the air conditioner that we eliminate that long trail of impacts. So whenever we are in the place to eliminate systems, eliminate pieces of systems, that's always going to be a wiser option in the future than to try and make those systems work despite the pressures. I would put to you that cities are actually a passive solution to our major problem, which is transportation. We already know that the denser a city is, the less energy use its inhabitants have. And the reason is really no big surprise, that when you live in a place that's relatively dense and is walkable, you have access to more stuff close by. And since the most sustainable trip we're ever going to take is the one we don't take in the first place because the thing we need is right next door, that works out well for us. What we really want is access by mobility, right? More driving is not anybody's goal. If anybody here, if I was to go to any of you and say, hey, I've got a great deal for you, I can put you in a house that will have you driving 90 minutes more a day, right? You wouldn't think that that was a terrific offer, right? None of us are looking to drive more. But we have this idea about cities, that they are failed, that they cannot work, which is in fact an antique future. It's seeing the future through a lens which is out of date. The reality is that cities in most places in the world are thriving. And that in most places, the urban parts of metropolitan districts are now doing better than their suburbs. Part of this is because there's an unprecedented shift towards demand in housing preference for walkable urbanism. The idea now, when you ask millennials what they want, they're not looking for a dream home, they're looking for a dream neighborhood. And neighborhoods, of course, as folks here know, are a solution in and of themselves. And it's possible to build more walkable urbanism. It's possible to build more of what we need. This is the Melbourne Corridor Plan. They basically came up with a way for concentrating all of their future growth along transit lines, making every one of the places in green essentially unchanged and yet turned into walkable urbanism by proximity to stuff. And we're not talking, wild visions here. We're talking taking streets that are like this and making them streets like this, right? Basically just creating more walkable urbanism. This isn't without its costs, of course. We have so successfully made this change that in most successful cities, housing prices are rising much faster than incomes. I'm from the Bay Area, where housing prices are rising at just astronomical rates. And there's a simple reason for this. It's supply and demand. We haven't built enough housing, right? And so one of the things that we're going to need to deal with is how do we increase housing supply at a really rapid rate in cities that are doing well? And that and the building of walkable urbanism, of course, can go hand in hand. There's no conflict there at all. And when people live in more walkable places, of course, we tend to live in smaller units. This is a 36 square meter apartment in Sao Paulo. A lot of people are taking to calling these apartments, right? And by our conventional way of looking at things, this seems kind of crazy, right? 36 square meters, that's nothing. That's like roughly 350 square feet, right? Something like that. And however, what we don't recognize is that this house works differently than homes that we're used to thinking of. This house is for somebody who spends most of their time living on the outside, right? That what's outside the door becomes more important than what's in. And when you start to look around and think, well, how can we possibly accommodate all this density with people who want to be outside as well, we start to realize there's one simple answer, and it's the roads and parking spaces. In Seattle, roads and parking alone make up 40% of the land area. It's much more in some other North American cities. And we can put that space to good use. We can turn it into green infrastructure and open space. We can use it to help us make our cities more climate rugged and resistant. But we can also use it to change the way that we're living and moving. Space for people, we need it. And biking and walking have sustainability benefits, of course, but they also have profound benefits in terms of our health and social life. Many of us tend to think of time of walking and biking as things that are just too time-consuming to fit into our lives. But there's this great researcher in Seattle named Alan Durning who bikes and walks to work. And a guy came to him and said anyway, so somebody said to him, why, how could you possibly afford to take this time, right? You're a busy guy. And he was like, okay, he's a quant guy. He was like, yeah, let me figure out, am I being crazy with my time allotment here? And so he looked at the amount of time that he was spending, and he said, well, to be fair, I better factor in other things like, the time it takes to park. And then he's like, and I better factor in the health effect. And what he found is that the longevity effects of exercising an extra half an hour to an hour a day, even light exercise, are such that he was gaining more time than he was spending, right? As he put it, time spent walking is utterly free because it's time you would have spent dead. And it's possible to build urban space that's really designed for people. And this is not the same kind of urban space we had 100 years ago before the car, right? It's a completely different urban space, and that's because it is layered over with the digital. Many of us grew up hearing about cyberspace, thinking of the idea of the digital as something out there, as something crazy that we'd all shut down and go to. But the digital isn't that. It's just a layer of life. It's unworthy of comment now to people who are immersed in it. It's like police protection. You don't even notice it till it's gone, right? And it is more and more and more a factor of essentially our every waking moment, right? There's this phrase, time to screen. You know, you can tell how far gone you are by your time to screen in the morning is the first thing you do to check email. And of course, this is meeting another force, which is force 3, which is walk-shed technologies. What is key is that when we have technology tied to place, places work differently. I do a lot of speaking to students as well, and I realized a year or two ago that I had to explain to students that there was a time before Google. That when we wanted to use the internet back in the age of the mammoth, we had to go to these things called directories. Anyone here remember a directory? Right? So it was like a list of links to things that might be like the things you were looking for, right? And you had to like click on links to like go find that thing, right? That was browsing. And now we have searching. And browsing seems utterly crazy, right? Because now we just type in a few words and it finds us the thing we want. Well, we are moving from browsable cities, cities we used to have to move through to find the things we wanted, right, to searchable cities. Cities where we know where things are and we know how to get to them. In fact, you know, the most basic kind of walk-shed technology is just the stuff that moves us through the city in the best possible way. We're probably the last generation that's going to remember what it feels like to get lost, right? Because everything has maps on it now, you know, and the degree to which our lives are increasingly online has also actually had a very strange effect in urban space, which is studies show that people who have more online social contacts tend to have more real-world contacts if they live in a city. That if you divide out essentially location, you find that people who live in cities and are wired, highly wired, actually are the most social people. And of course, it's not just about wayfinding and about having a digital life that connects you to people. It's also about the way that we move through cities themselves and the kinds of cities we're moving through, right? We are on our way to having a one-to-one map of the city, right? In fact, this is a one-to-one map of downtown San Francisco. We're on the way to being able to measure directly or indirectly vast amounts of what's going on around us. Now, of course, it doesn't measure everything, and the map is not the territory. And in fact, we have competing maps being run at each other. And if you want to get the downside of all this, I encourage you to read a guy named Adam Greenfield, who's brilliant on this subject. And also, it's not really about maps so much as how we interact with them. Many of you have probably seen Google Glass. This has not really gone over well. There was a famous transvestite bartender in San Francisco who said, "Wearing Google Glass in public is a sign you either live in a bubble or are new." And that is the biggest disdain that a San Franciscan can throw at somebody. So, you know, this is not the way the future is going to look, right? If nothing else, there's already a backlash to the idea of surveillance. We're starting to see no glass signs in San Francisco, but people are also starting to wear dazzle makeup, and, you know, at least in theory, to fool facial recognition, right? So that when they're being surveilled by their peers, they can't be found out. And there's a lot of anger about the idea that that basically, if you don't know what the product is you, right? And for many, many services around us, the product is us. And there's a big backlash to that. So I don't think that we're going to, in fact, see lots of Google Glass, lots of surveillance. I think that what we're seeing is already something that's much more subtle, right? Something that is about the way that data is integrated into the systems around us without us having to pay much attention to it. This is going to change how we think about things. And the biggest way it's going to change things is through what I think of as service invocation. The ability to summon services without actually having possession of the thing that gives the service is what is increasingly defining urban life, right? Now, one easy way to think of this is transportation as service, right? Car sharing was mentioned before. We have Car2Go, where you can, you know, grab a car, drive it anywhere within certain zones and just get out. We have things like Uber, which are private driver services. In San Francisco, we're increasingly getting private transit services. Not a trend I think is particularly great, but we're beginning to see bus lines running through the city paid for by various companies like Google and Apple and so forth. We're beginning to see really weird niche transportation services like Boost, which will come pick your kids up and drop them off with pre-vetted, background checked drivers. So that if you can't make it to get, little Susie to her ballet session, a Boost driver can. And of course, we're seeing a dramatic shift towards delivery. And delivery is transportation as a surface that's just hidden behind a thin wall, right? So more and more we're seeing web fronts, things where the activity is not interacting with inventory there on site, it's interacting with some representative stuff that lets us choose what we want, and then it's delivered to us later. And since delivery is dramatically more sustainable than driving to get things, this is inherently a good idea. But it's also highlighting, with things like the German PAC stations and other similar programs, where you can go and they can leave a package for you if you don't have a secure place to put it in front of your apartment. And then you just go, you swipe a card or type in a number and it spits out your package. This is highlighting the degree to which services are starting to be designed for people who don't own cars, right? Whose means of carrying things through the city is not the trunk of a car, but a backpack, right? So designing digital layers for people who live with backpacks, right? Live out of backpacks. How many people here own a home drill? Okay, my favorite statistic in the world, the average home power drill is used somewhere between 6 and 20 minutes in its entire lifetime, right? And most of us buy home drills for the same reason I did. I wanted to put some holes in the wall to hang a picture, right? So what we want is the hole, we buy the drill. This is a crazy way of organizing society, right? And more there are sharing services. And I know we're going to hear a lot more about how people are working peer-to-peer and in other ways to share products, right? What I want to say, though, is that there's a way in which some of this stuff is starting to transcend our understanding of it. For example, the Japanese have taken this to a whole new level. This is a cat-sharing cafe, where people who can't have cats in their apartments can come and have a cup of tea and pet a cat. And more of our life is connected to ways in which we are able to track and share, right? The ability to track and trade objects is now pretty superficial, but even weirder, I think, is that place is becoming a service, right? We are really unused to this. This is something that is a native 21st century thing, that spaces are becoming recombinant, reconfigurable. It's easier to use a space for a very short time. Are most of you familiar with the idea of pop-up stores? Right? Okay, so a pop-up store, if you think about it, is a digital network instantiated. Because if the pop-up store didn't already have a large Facebook group, a large number of Twitter followers, et cetera, and it just moved into a store and nobody knew it was there, it would fail immediately, right? The precondition to having a pop-up store is having a network of people who want the thing, right? So it's just an instantiation in temporary space of a need. We're seeing more and more of these things like co-working spaces and so forth, but we're also starting to see it in residential. If I had more time, I'd talk about how residential spaces are increasingly becoming flexible spaces where people have the ability to expand their effective space at need. So things like shared kitchens and dining rooms in large buildings where people can entertain even if they live in a 360 square foot apartment. And it's important to remember, I think, that the technology that we're dealing with is still accelerating at an incredibly rapid rate. And that one of the things that that's doing is generating a new way of interacting, which hasn't existed before, which is the trust grid, right? And the trust grid, simply put, is I don't know you, but you and I have enough connections in ways that I trust, that I'm going to trust that you are as if you are part of my community. I'm going to trust that you are somebody who I can rely on, right? That is not a thing that we've done in the past, and it is increasingly becoming the way the world works. And I think that the combination of technological acceleration and that social change is going to mean that more and more things that we've thought of as permanent, as things we own, as things that just exist, are in fact turning into services around us. And that means that space is a service, movement is a service, product use is a service. The city becomes more and more a bundle of services, not a set of places alone. We're used to seeing the world from behind the windshield of the 20th century. I am pretty sure that we're going to see a very different world in the next 20 years. You can reach me here. Thank you very much.